So, hello and welcome back to another evening with Sir Walter Scott and his. Honestly, I'm starting to just think this is a very foundational book for everything that we ever dreamed up because I don't think that this is historical, at least not in any accurate sense. But it does seem to be the origin for so much of our whole idea about medieval times. So, welcome back to Ivanhoe, where Ivan is hoeing. That sounded dumb. Anyway, I hope you guys are having a good week. I had an exciting night last night because we had a magnetic storm. And whenever we have a magnetic storm, particularly a strong one, there's always the chance of the aurora coming out. And I did get to see it last night. Not as strong as I saw it last year. Last year, I feel like was one of those once or twice in a lifetime auroras, but it was still pretty good. I got to see a good amount of red and then some of the like lilacs and of course the green. So that was cool. I got a couple of decent pictures and then my tripod fell in the lake. It's fine. It's out now, obviously, or you wouldn't be sitting there. You'd be sitting on a pile of books and things would be weird. But yeah, it was a good night. Let me know in the comments if you got to see the aurora, because I think it was visible as far south as at least partway into the lower peninsula of Michigan, which means probably a lot of the northeastern coast, and then over in the Great Plains, it was probably also visible. I hope you got to see it if you live in a place where it was. So, yeah. Anyway, we're told that we're going to be switching perspectives from our Friar Tuck lookalike and King Richard. I mean the Black Knight and the Wandering Hermit. Except I think I already know who they are. But we got told that we're going to go visiting with another perspective character. So don't know who we're going to see. And so far, speaking of likable characters in here, I don't hate the Black Knight. I feel like the Black Knight is being painted at least kind of in a good light. And our hermit, Friar Tuck, despite being maybe not the most pious of all friars, is coming off better than the prior. So the friar is better than the prior. So I guess that's where we're going to be. Also, our quote at the beginning of this is from Ederic Forrest, and it reads, "Away! Our journey lies through dell and dingle, where blithe fawn trips by its timid mother, where the broad oak with intercepting boughs checks the sunbeam in the greensward alley. Up and away, for lovely paths are these, to tread when the glad sun is on his throne, less pleasant and less safe when Cynthia's lamp with doubtful glimmer leads or lights the dreary forest." And that was Ederic Forrest. Interesting. It painted a good picture. I guess we're going into the forest. Maybe we're going to play with Robin of Locksley, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see as we jump back into chapter 18 of Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. When Cedric the Saxon saw his son drop down senseless in the lists at Ashby, his first impulse was to order him into the custody and care of his own attendants, but the words choked in his throat. He could not bring himself to acknowledge, in the presence of such an assembly, the son whom he had renounced and disinherited. He ordered, however, Oswald to keep an eye on him, and directed that officer, with two of his serfs, to convey Ivanhoe to Ashby as soon as the crowd had dispersed. Oswald, however, was anticipated in this good office. The crowd dispersed indeed, but our knight was nowhere to be seen. It was in vain that Cedric's cupbearer looked around for his young master. He saw the bloody spot on which he had lately sunk, but himself saw no longer. It seemed as if the fairies had conveyed him away from the spot. Perhaps Oswald, for the Saxons were quite superstitious, might have adopted some such hypothesis to account for Ivanhoe's disappearance, had he not suddenly cast his eye upon a person attired like a squire, in whom he recognized the features of his fellow servant Gurth. Anxious about his master's fate, and in despair at his sudden disappearance, the translated swineherd was searching for him everywhere, and had neglected in doing so the concealment upon which his own safety depended. Oswald deemed it his duty to secure Gurth as a fugitive of whose fate his master had to judge. Renewing his inquiries concerning the fate of Ivanhoe, the only information which the cupbearer could collect from the bystanders was that the knight had been raised with care by certain well-attired grooms, and placed on a litter belonging to a lady among the spectators, which had immediately transported him out. Oswald, receiving this intelligence, resolved to return to his master and get more instructions, taking along with him Gurth, who he considered in some sort as a deserter from Cedric's service. The Saxon had been under very intense and agonizing apprehensions concerning his son, for nature had asserted her rights in spite of the patriotic stoicism which labored to disown her. But no sooner was he informed that Ivanhoe was in careful and probably friendly hands, than the paternal anxiety which had been excited by the dubiety of his fate gave way anew to a feeling of injured pride and resentment at what he termed his son Wilfred's filial disobedience. "Let him wander his way," he said, "and leech his wounds for whose sake he encountered them. He is fitter to do the juggling tricks of Norman chivalry than to maintain the fame and honor of his English ancestry with the glaive and the brown bill and the good old weapons of his own country." "If to maintain the honor of ancestry," said Rowena, "it is sufficient to be wise in counsel and brave in execution, to be boldest among the bold and gentlest among the gentle, I know no voice save his father's." "Be silent, Rowena. On this subject only I hear you not. Get ready for the prince's festival. We have been summoned there with unwonted circumstance of honor and courtesy, such as the Normans rarely have used to our race since the fatal day of Hastings, and therefore I will go, if only to show these proud Normans how little the fate of a son who could defeat their bravest of Saxons could affect me." "Then," said Rowena, do I not go? And I pray you beware, lest what you mean for courage and constancy shall be accounted as a hardened heart." "Remain home, then, ungrateful lady," said Cedric. "Yours is a hard heart, which can sacrifice the weal of an oppressed people to an idle and unauthorized affection. I seek the noble Athelstine, and with him I will attend the banquet of Jean of Anjou." And he went accordingly to the banquet, of which we have already mentioned in the principal events. Immediately upon retiring from the castle, the Saxon thanes with their attendants took to horse, and it was during the bustle which attended their doing so that Cedric for the first time cast his eyes upon the deserter Gurth. This noble Saxon had returned from the banquet, as we had seen, in a very bad humor, and wanted only a pretext for wreaking his anger upon someone. "The gyves," he said, "the gyves! Oswald, Hunderbert, dogs and villains! Why is this knave unfettered?" And without daring to remonstrate, the companions of Gurth bound him with a halter as the readiest cord which was at hand. He submitted without saying a word, except that, darting a reproachful look at his master, said, "This comes of loving your flesh and blood better than my own." "To horse," said Cedric. "It is indeed full time," said Athelstine, "for if we ride not the faster, the worthy Abbot Wathford's preparations for rear supper will be spoiled." The travellers, however, used such speed as to reach the convent of St. Withold's before the apprehended evil took place. The abbot himself, of ancient Saxon descent, received the noble Saxons with the profuse and exuberant hospitality of their nation, wherein they indulged to a late, or rather an early hour. Nor did they take leave of their host the next morning until they had shared with him a sumptuous feast again. As the cavalcade left the court of the monastery, an incident happened somewhat alarming to the Saxons, who, of all people of Europe, were the most addicted to a superstitious observance of omens, and to whose opinions can be traced most of these notions upon such subjects that are still to be found among our populace to this day. For the Normans, being a mixed race, and better informed according to the information of the times, had lost most of the superstitious prejudice that their ancestors had brought with them from Scandinavia, and they piqued themselves upon thinking freely on these topics. But in the present instance, the apprehensions of impending evil was inspired by no less a respectable prophet than a large, lean, black dog, who, sitting upright, howled most piteously as the riders left the gate, and soon thereafter, barking and jumping to and fro, seemed bent upon attacking itself. "I don't like that music, Father Cedric," said Athelstine, for by this title of respect he was accustomed to addressing Cedric the Saxon. "Nor I either, uncle," said Wamba. "I greatly fear we will have to pay the piper." "In my mind," said Athelstine, upon whose memory the abbot's good ale, for Burton was already famous for that liquor, had made an impression, "in my mind we had better turn back and stay with the abbot until this afternoon. It's unlucky to travel where your path is crossed by a monk, a hare, or a howling dog, not until you've eaten your next meal." "Oh, away," said Cedric. "The day is already too short for our journey. As to the dog, I know it to be the cur of the runaway slave Gurth, useless, just like its master." And saying this, and rising at the same time in his stirrups, impatient at the interruption of his journey, he launched his javelin at poor Fangs, for indeed Fangs it was, who, having traced his master this far upon his stolen expedition, had lost the scent, and was now in his own uncouth way rejoicing at Gurth's reappearance. The javelin inflicted a wound upon the animal's shoulder, and barely missed pinning him down to the earth. And so Fangs fled, howling, from the presence of the enraged Thane, and Gurth's heart swelled within him, for he felt this meditated the slaughter of his faithful adherent in a degree much deeper than anything that had happened to him. Having in vain attempted to raise his hand to his eyes, Gurth said to Wamba, who, seeing his master's ill humor, had prudently retreated to the rear, "I pray, do me a kindness. Wipe my eyes with your mantle. The dust doesn't offend me, and these bindings won't let me help myself one way or the other." Wamba did him the service he requested, and they rode side by side for some time, during which time Gurth maintained a moody silence, but finally he could repress his thoughts no longer. "Friend Wamba," he said, "of all those who are fools enough to serve Cedric, you alone have dexterity enough to make your folly acceptable to him. Go to him, therefore, and tell him that neither love nor fear will Gurth serve him any longer. He may strike my head, he may scourge me, he may load me with irons, but from here on he will never compel me, either to love or obey him. Go to him, Wamba, and tell him that Gurth, the son of Beowulf, renounces his service." "Assuredly," said Wamba. "Fool as I am, I shall not do your fool's errand. Cedric has another javelin stuck into his belt, and you know he does not always miss." "I don't care," said Gurth, "how soon he makes a mark of me. Yesterday he left Wilfred, my young master, in his blood. Today he has tried to kill in front of my face the only other living creature that's ever showed me kindness. By St. Edmund, St. Dunstan, St. Withold, St. Edward the Confessor, and every other Saxon saint on the calendar." For Cedric never swore by any saint that was not of Saxon lineage, and all of his household had that same limited devotion. "I will never forgive him." "To my thinking," said the jester, who was frequently called on to act as peacemaker in the family, "our master did not actually want to hurt Fangs, just frighten him. For, if you watched, he rose in his stirrups, and thereby meaning to overcast the mark, and he would have, except Fangs happened to bound up at that very moment and received a scratch, which I am sure is going to heal with just a little bit of tar." "If I thought that," said Gurth, "if I could but think so. But no, I saw the javelin was well aimed. I heard it whiz through the air with all the wrathful malevolence of he who cast it, and it quivered after it pitched into the ground, as if in regret for missing its mark. By the hog dear to St. Anthony, I renounce that man." And the indignant swineherd resumed his sullen silence, which no effort of the jester could again induce him to break. Meanwhile, Cedric and Athelstine, the leaders of the troop, conversed together upon the state of the land and the dissension of the royal family, on the feuds and quarrels among the Norman nobles, and on the chance which there was that the oppressed Saxons might be able to free themselves from the yoke of the Normans, or at least elevate themselves to national consequence and independence during the convulsions which were likely to come. On this subject, Cedric was completely animated. The restoration of the independence of his race was the idol in his heart to which he had willingly sacrificed domestic happiness and the interests of his own son. But in order to achieve this great revolution in favor of the native English, it was necessary that they should be united amongst themselves, and it was necessary to act under an acknowledged head. The necessity of choosing their chief from the Saxon blood royal was not only evident in and of itself, it had been made a solemn condition by those who Cedric had entrusted with his secret hopes. Athelstine had this quality at least, and though he had very few mental accomplishments or talents to recommend him as a leader, he had still a goodly person, he was no coward, and he had been accustomed to martial exercises and seemed willing to defer to the advice of counselors who were wiser than himself. And above all, he was known to be liberal and hospitable, and thought to be good-natured. But whatever pretensions Athelstine had to be considered as head of the Saxon Confederacy, many other Saxons of the nation were disposed to prefer to his title that of Lady Rowena, who drew her descent from Alfred, and whose father, having been a chief renowned for wisdom, courage, and generosity, his memory was highly honored by his countrymen. It would have been no difficult thing for Cedric, had he been so disposed, to have placed himself at the head of a third party, at least as formidable as the others. To counterbalance their royal descent, Cedric had courage, activity, energy, and above all, that devoted attachment to the cause which had procured him the name of the Saxon. and his birth was inferior to no one, except only that of Athelstine and his ward Rowena. These qualities, however, were unalloyed by the slightest shade of selfishness, and instead of dividing yet further his weakened nation by forming his own faction, it was a part in Cedric's plan to extinguish that which already existed by encouraging a marriage between Rowena and Athelstine. An obstacle occurred to this. His favorite project in the mutual attachment of his ward and his son, and hence that was actually the original cause of the banishment of Wilfrid from the house of his father. Cedric had done this in hopes that during Wilfrid's absence, Rowena might relinquish her preference for him, but in this he had been disappointed. A disappointment which might be attributed in part to the mode which his ward had been educated. Cedric, to whom the name of Alfred was almost as high as a deity, had treated the sole remaining scion of that great monarch with a degree of observance such as perhaps was in those days rarely paid to an acknowledged princess. Rowena's will had been in almost every case a law in Cedric's household, and Cedric himself, as though determined that her sovereignty should be fully acknowledged within that little circle if nowhere else, seemed to take a pride in acting as the very first and foremost of her subject. Thus, being trained in the exercise not only of free will, but of despotic authority, Rowena was, by her previous education, disposed both to resist and to resent any attempt to control her affections, or to dispose of her hand contrary to her own inclination, and to assert her independence in a case in which even those females who have been trained up to obedience and subjugation are not infrequently apt to dispute the authority of their guardians and parents. The opinions that Rowena felt strongly, she avowed boldly, and Cedric, who could not free himself of his habitual deference to her opinions, felt at a loss as to how to enforce his authority over her. It was in vain that he attempted to dazzle her with the prospects of a throne. Rowena, who possessed strong sense, neither considered his plan as practical or desirable as far as she was concerned. Could it have been achieved without attempting to conceal her preference of Wilfrid of Ivanhoe? She declared that, were that favored knight out of the question, she would rather go live in a convent than share a throne with Athelstine, who, having always despised, she now began, on account of the trouble she received on this, to thoroughly hate. Nonetheless, Cedric, whose opinion of women's constancy was not very strong, persisted using every means in his power to bring the proposed match to fruition, in which he was convinced he was rendering an important service to the Saxon cause by doing. The sudden and quite romantic appearance of his son on the lists at Ashby he had justly regarded as just about a death blow to all of his hopes. His paternal affection, it's true, had for a moment gained victory over pride and patriotism, but both of those had now returned in full force, and under their joint operation he was now bent upon making a determined effort for the union of Athelstine and Rowena, together with expediting all of those other measures which seemed necessary to forward the restoration of the Saxon kingdom. To this last subject he was now laboring with Athelstine, not without having reason, every now and then, to lament, though, like Hotspur, that he should have moved such a dish of skimmed milk to so honorable an action. Athelstine, it's true, was vain enough, and loved to have his ears tickled with tales of his own high descent and bloodline, and of his right by inheritance to homage and sovereignty, but his petty vanity was sufficiently gratified by receiving this at the hands of his immediate attendants and all the other Saxons who approached him, if he had the courage to encounter danger. He did at least hate the trouble of going to seek it out, and while he agreed in general everything that Cedric said concerning the claim of the Saxons to independence, and he was still more easily convinced about his own ability to reign over them when that independence was attained, the means of asserting these rights, when they came to be discussed, well, he was still Athelstan the Unready. Slow, irresolute, procrastinating, and unenterprising. The warm, impassioned arguments of Cedric had as little an effect upon his temper as red hot balls lighting in the water, which produce a little bit of sound and smoke, but instantly go out. If leaving this task, which might be compared to spurring on a tired jade or hammering on cold iron, Cedric fell back to Rowena, but he received little more satisfaction from speaking with her. For as his presence interrupted the speaking between the lady and her favorite attendant upon the gallantry and the possible fate of Wilfred, Agatha failed not to revenge both her mistress and herself by recurring to the overthrow of Athelstine on the lists, a most disagreeable subject which could greet the ears of poor Cedric. To this sturdy Saxon, therefore, the entire day's journey was fraught with all matter of displeasure and discomfort, so that he more than once internally cursed the tournament, and he who had proclaimed it, together with his own folly of even going. At noon, upon the motion of Athelstine, the travelers paused in the woodland shade by a fountain to rest their horses and partake of some provisions with which the hospitable abbot had loaded an entire sumpter mule. Their feast was a long one, and these several interruptions rendered it impossible for them to be able to hope to reach Rotherford without traveling through the night, a conviction which induced them to proceed on their way at a more quick pace than they had been using so far. And that is the end of the chapter. That one was a travel chapter. Travel chapters always remind me of travel episodes in an anime or a TV series where a lot happens and we got a lot of information. I can't remember who Prince John promised Rowena to, but it sounds like the poor girl is in a three-way tug-of-war or is about to be. Oh, and we don't know if Robin Hood's going to throw his hat in the act. I guess we'll have to wait and see. You know, the interesting thing about Ivanhoe is we've definitely gotten Robin Hood, which is our Locksley character. We've gotten Friar Tuck in The Hermit. We have who I think is King Richard in The Black Knight. Prince John, obviously. But who is Ivanhoe supposed to be in the Robin Hood mythos? I mean, he probably isn't, but that keeps nagging at me. I'm like, I've recognized all of these other characters from the tropes that they originated in, but I'm not getting a trope from Ivanhoe, possibly because we haven't spent much time with him yet. We're spending a lot of time in all the people that are in a sphere around him, but we haven't spent much time with him. Also, I'm starting to wonder about Rowena now, because she sounds like a bit of a spoiled brat. I was hoping she would be more sympathetic. Anyway, that is where we're going to leave it today. I hope that you enjoyed that chapter as much as I did, even if I stumbled over my words a few times. Please do hit the thumbs up on your way out. It does always make me smile. And if you're interested, there are pictures on my Instagram from the Aurora last night. The links to that, as well as the links to the Patreon, my Blue Sky, though I don't post there often, are all on my main page. So if you're interested, follow me over there. But no matter what, have an awesome day, and I'll see you tomorrow.